Why the Rings of Power is Anti-Tolkien. Now that the first season of the Amazon show Rings of Power came to an end, I too wanted to take time and give my take on it. So I'm also joining the ranks of so many people who started to create content here on YouTube and elsewhere in order to defend Tolkien. There are already many worthy analyses concerning the show, whether in form of YouTube videos or in form of articles. They all explain at great length all the faults, and there are many, of this series and how it violates much of the aspects needed to be considered a good show on the one hand, or a good Tolkien adaptation on the other. This will not be a rehashing of all of these very true and valid points, but more like a meta-analysis of the series from a Catholic perspective. The Rings of Power, an anti-myth. Let's ask, what does a good myth do? A good myth is revealing eternal patterns to us through epic and often fantastic narrative, to convey truth in a metaphysical sense. The escape into the imaginary becomes the escape into higher reality. So the basic ingredients, in my opinion, for a myth are narrative and truth. The Rings of Power series is really anti-both. If you watch the episodes, you can actually see how the basic form of narration itself, i.e. cause and effect, are inverted. The cause of an event in the series is so often not the scene that came before it, but the scene that will come afterwards. The writers needed a specific thing to happen, so therefore they wrote an appropriate, or rather inappropriate, event, so that the moment that they wanted to achieve is accomplished. The effect is made into the cause, making the viewing experience astonishingly awkward and forced. It is quite literally an anti-narrative, where story beats are mainly made up just to unnaturally reach a point that was needed for the plot. Don't get me wrong, the problem is not to be aware as a writer of the trajectory and the ending of the story you want to tell, but it is how you get there. If there is no natural or supernatural progression, you have betrayed the very essence of storytelling. Of course, it doesn't stop there, because the show is also anti-truth. This phenomenon is obviously nested in a bigger problem, namely the relativism of our time and the assertion that truth is ultimately subjective. It is certainly not to be expected nowadays to get a show which is crystal clear in a Catholic, i.e. true sense, on the question of truth. But let us look at the Rings of Power. You can, for example, clearly see this anti-truth notion when it comes to the treatment of the orcs. If you decide to give that which is supposed to be inherently evil and understandable cause, when you try to give them reasonable motives, what you are basically saying is that they are merely following their truth. And just as a short side note here, I know that the question of the orcs is a complicated one, and Tolkien had several theories about their origination, the most popular being the one in which they are corrupted elves. And there lie actually a few problems, if you want to maintain certain aspects of Catholic theology, which was very important to Tolkien. Concerning, for example, the state of their supposed soul or the possibility of redemption. Can orcs be redeemed? These questions get pretty complicated rather quickly. I won't dive into it here. My point is that in his stories, Tolkien surely wanted the orcs to act as demon-like pure evil creatures which were irredeemable and had to be killed and wiped out. So don't try to be smarter than Tolkien and do the orcs as Tolkien did them, because you are creating more problems by trying to supposedly solve one, and you are definitely not smarter than Tolkien. In a broader sense, it is also anti-truth because in the show, the unchanging aspects of the human condition are not properly represented. Rather, they wanted to reflect the world we live in today. Even their haircuts look modern and dated. Where do the elves get their hair wax from? Maybe that's the real reason why they needed the mithril. It also doesn't properly incarnate the eternal patterns which we need and want to see in an epic fantasy story. The show doesn't have this symphonic, unkey union between the invisible and the visible, between form and matter, between heaven and earth, which is truth. This is not arbitrary. For example, the concept of warrior finds its proper incarnation in a typically also physically strong man. So this anti-truth to corrupt, for example, the character of Galadriel, who was in many ways inspired by Our Lady the Virgin Mary, in such a way. And I know that defenders of the show are trying to justify this portrayal by quoting a few statements from Tolkien regarding the athletic qualities of the man-maiden Galadriel. But these arguments don't work. Not only timeline-wise, in the Second Age, Galadriel had already settled down long ago, but also essentially. Galadriel is a woman. Now, there can be women with more masculine qualities to them, of course, but they still remain women, and they will act like women, according to their very nature and being. Eowyn, for example, who also took up a sword, was still very loving and graceful all the way through. Hollywood has a huge problem with women being actual women, so the blonde elf warrior in the show is not only a misrepresentation of Galadriel, but a misrepresentation and actually also a condemnation of women as a whole. It is also anti-truth to have unrealistic and inauthentic, diverse representation in a world that is supposed to take place in a middle-age-like European setting. And no, we are not racist to point this out. It is anti-truth to portray the hierarchical structures in Tolkien's world as either heavily damaged in the case of Durin and his father, or as a weird political apparatus that feels like a bureaucratic communication nightmare in the case of the elves in Dindon. These are all lies breathed through computer-generated images. If there ever was an anti-myth, the Rings of Power is one. In the beginning was the Word. What does logos mean, and how can a story be anti-logos? The meaning of this concept contains so much depth that it is hard to grasp. Many books have been written on it. It does not only mean word, but it is much broader. Logos is more like the order of the universe, as E. Michael Jones put it. To be anti-logos is to be anti-order. Now, have you seen the show? The chaos, the inconsistencies, the illogical storytelling is almost unbearable. To make any kind of sense of the scenes, we have to make huge assumptions of what has happened off-screen. It almost feels like a rebellion against orderly storytelling itself, and like an insult to our intelligence. The funny thing is that the most logical storytelling that came out of this series are the things that had to be made up by discontent viewers in order to make sense of this chaotic mess. And he separated the light from the darkness. One of the gravest sins of this show, in my opinion, was their portrayal of light and darkness. It is no surprise that in such a chaotic, anti-order story there will be a mixing rather than a clear separation of good and evil. Galadriel has to touch the darkness to find the light, and Mithril is basically made out of the mixing of the good spirit of an elf and the evil power of a Balrog. The first advice would have made sense if it was given by the corrupt wizard Saruman. He investigated the evil arts to such an extent, and we could infer that in this process he would also have touched the darkness, that he got tempted by relativism and ultimately fell. In the show, though, it is supposed to be the wisest of the elves, Finrod Felagund, who gives this advice to Galadriel. What an insult to Tolkien, and what more of an insult to the order of good and evil itself. The idea that it is favorable to do evil in order to really know what is good is profoundly anti-Tolkien. In the instance of Mithril, what we have to deal with is a somewhat Manichaean idea of good and evil, a dualistic view that postulates good and evil as two opposite powers. This view, the earth and man were a byproduct of the battle between good and evil, as is Mithril a byproduct of this fight between the elf and the Balrog. There are many things to say about the faulty nature of Manichaeism itself and its heavy Gnostic influences, but in this video it suffices to say that it goes clearly against the metaphysics of Tolkien's world and Tolkien's worldview. To not understand logos, i.e. proper order, is to conflate various faulty metaphysical claims and mix it into a story trying to sound philosophical and deep. This show is truly anti-logos. The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamental religious and Catholic work. After one learns about this fact, it becomes very hard trying to separate Tolkien's work and his Catholic faith. It is, in my opinion, the most sense-making lens through which we can read his writings. The Catholic faith is to Middle-earth as a secondary world, what the incarnation of Jesus Christ is to our primary world. The one thing that makes the most sense of everything else. I recommend reading C.S. Lewis's great book Miracles on this subject. Can one adapt the Tolkien story without its Catholicity, without its Christianity, which is always absorbed into the story and symbolism, as Tolkien once said? We will see that in trying to do so, you will create stories that are actually anti-Tolkien. One at Amazon Studios might have thought, we have a huge budget and we have the intellectual property. Now it's time for us to do what Tolkien never could. Update his world to the world we live in today, deprive it from its deep religiosity and patriarchal tendencies, and make it even better. However, they reckoned without their host. For it is Tolkien's profound Roman Catholic faith that made his stories not only so successful but so rich and, although this is a prediction, everlasting, like for example Dante's works. To leave out or replace the deep Christian message that every story of Tolkien has, and especially The Lord of the Rings, means to kill the spirit, the very soul of such a story. You cannot make a good Tolkienian adaptation without maintaining a deep Catholic and Christian spirit within it. To try to do so will render your adaptation soulless, a mere shell without depth and no living spirit within it. The show The Rings of Power is manifestly anti-Catholic and anti-Tolkien because it disregards so many basic truths that the Catholic faith, and therefore also Tolkien, stand for. Having to touch the darkness to find the light is anti-Catholic. Theorizing that evil could have a proper place to live in the world is anti-Catholic. Not having a logos-based narrative is anti-Catholic. To not have one proper portrayal of masculinity and femininity is, you guessed it, anti-Catholic. Therefore, this show becomes also manifestly anti-Tolkien. First and foremost because it disregards the Catholic spirit of Tolkien's secondary world, but also, secondly, because it tramples over things that were very important to Tolkien in terms of realistic fantasy, like distances, traveling, and magic. I mean, look at the Númenóreans, they're supposed to sail thousands of miles within only a few days. It's ridiculous. And in terms of magic, actually in Tolkien's world, there is no magic like we see in, for example, Harry Potter or other fantasy shows, where a character just sort of makes things happen through a spell out of thin air. No, Tolkien's magic is much more nuanced. In the case of the elves, it is rather higher art and advanced craftsmanship, which seems like magic to someone like a hobbit. This also includes technological devices. The Palantiri, for example, which were made by the elves, are a highly developed technological tool, and they act basically as a super phone or a television. It literally means far-seer, which is the German word for television. In the case of Gandalf, who is basically an angel, he's rather performing miracles rather than magic, which he, by the way, never does on a whim. He always has to have a good reason and a specific purpose. So to do magic like they did in The Rings of Power is to not really understand how Tolkien wanted magic, so to speak, work in his world. Another thing I wanted to mention is their apparent misconception or misunderstanding of the nature of so-called chance meetings in Tolkien's world. In Tolkien's world, a chance meeting is a saying that more or less refers to a providential act by Eru Ilúvatar, who is God. When Gandalf has his chance meeting with Thorin Oakenshield and the Prancing Pony, it was actually God's will for them to meet. So when in The Rings of Power, Galadriel says that her meeting with Halbrand was a chance meeting, one is led to believe that she refers to Providence. But later she tells Halbrand that their meeting was not out of mere chance, but the work of something greater, referring probably to Ilúvatar, which would mean that it actually was a chance meeting. This is a clear contradiction. So either Galadriel has no idea what she is talking about, or the showrunners just didn't get it. There is one word for all this: anti-Tolkien. Imagine the hubris you must possess to even assume that your story or your adaptation, devoid of all Tolkien and Catholic concepts, will be the novel Tolkien never wrote, and then think it can be on the same level as his stories. It won't work because the showrunners are lacking actual creativity, which means creating with devotion and submission to the one who gave them the world where they are able to create, in this case Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien was of the opinion that we as humans cannot create in a strict sense, which would mean making something out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. Only God is able to do that, so he coined the term sub-creation, which is in a sense a faculty given to us by God. Because our God is a creator, we want to imitate him like a son imitates his father, and so we create, but only with everything he has given to us, so we sub-create. But to understand sub-creation properly means also that you have to submit to God, to the giver of the gift, out of love and respect. If you don't do that, chances are that your sub-creations are going sideways and become mockeries of the things that are. I think you see where I want to go with this. Since I've heard about the show and then watched it, a thought came into my head on how a story in the Legendarium could be applied here. Maybe we shouldn't stretch this analogy too far, but it is one of the more profound reasons why I think the series is anti-Tolkien and was bound to fail. In the Ainulindale, when Eru Ilúvatar created the world, he gave his first creations, the offspring of his thought, different and distinct faculties, so that they might create with him the world in great harmony. But one of the Ainur, the mightiest of them all, Melkor, was not satisfied with his place in the hierarchy, and he didn't want to submit to Eru. He envied the supreme creator and wanted to make things of his own, so he went into the void and looked for the imperishable flame, the supreme spirit who vivifies, but couldn't find it, because it was with Ilúvatar. So he rebelled and caused discord in the Song of Creation, and after a long fight, both spiritually and materially, he finally got defeated. For me, it's hard not to see parallels to the story of how Rings of Power was made. Like Melkor, they actually tried to create without the giver, which in this case is Tolkien, of the gift, which in this case is Middle-earth. We can see that in how they made their choice on what to adapt. They chose the Second Age, with only being able to use the appendices of the Lord of the Rings, which evidently leaves so much open. So they literally went into a void and tried to give something life without the spirit of Tolkien, which is impossible and only creates a mockery. It is apparent from their choices for the show that they didn't want to submit to Tolkien, so to speak. They didn't want to just take a small place in the legacy of Tolkien, honoring his work. They wanted to create a Tolkien mega-epic, and because of metaphysical realities represented in Tolkien's work, which one would have to submit, which again they didn't, they failed. You cannot truly create without submitting to your creator. You cannot write a Tolkienian story without submitting to Tolkien. No, this bad attempt of creating not fan fiction and giving to it a false canonicity will not go down well in history. It will be and already has been fought, rightly so, and ultimately will be forgotten. Luckily, that is for sure. Tolkien's epic tales, on the other hand, will survive. The Amazon Rings of Power series is merely a passing thing, and above all shadows rides the sun. So these are my reasons why I think The Rings of Power is a fundamentally bad and anti-Tolkien show. What are your thoughts? Thank you for watching and listening, and don't forget, The Lord of the Rings is a fundamentally religious and Catholic work.